The paper ripped so loudly that every child in the room flinched. Not because paper is usually loud, but because this tear carried intent. It happened in a fourth-grade classroom at Riverside Elementary, just after the morning announcements ended and just before anyone understood that something irreversible had begun. 11-year-old Ethan Carter stood beside his desk, his hands hanging stiffly at his sides, as the pieces of his carefully written assignment fluttered down and landed near his worn sneakers. His teacher, Margaret Sloan, did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She held the torn pages loosely, as if what she had just done required no explanation at all. Experience, after all, was on her side. 26 years in the same classroom had taught her what truth usually looked like, and what exaggeration often sounded like. "This," she said calmly, addressing the entire class rather than the boy in front of her, "is what happens when imagination goes too far." Ethan did not move. His mind lagged a step behind the moment, still trying to understand how the neat paragraphs he had written the night before had become something shameful. He had chosen his words carefully. He had left things out. He had followed the rules his parents had taught him without ever fully explaining why those rules existed. But none of that seemed to matter now. Margaret Sloan continued, her tone steady and instructional, the way it always was when she believed she was doing the right thing. She explained that generals lived in large homes, that their children attended private schools, that families like that had a certain visibility, a certain polish. She did not say Ethan's name again. She did not have to. Everyone knew who she meant. "Truth," she added, "has a way of making sense when you look at it closely." A few students shifted in their seats. Some stared at the floor. Others stared at Ethan, curiosity mixing with discomfort. No one laughed. No one defended him. Silence settled in, thick and heavy, the kind of silence that feels like agreement even when it isn't. Ethan felt his face grow warm, then hot. He wanted to speak. He wanted to say that everything he had written was true, that he had checked with his parents, that he had even removed details so it would sound more believable. But the words stayed lodged in his chest. Margaret Sloan dropped the remaining scraps into the trash and brushed her hands together once, as if clearing dust. "We don't make ourselves special by telling stories," she said. "We earn respect by being honest." She turned back toward her desk, already moving on. For Ethan, time seemed to slow. The classroom around him felt distant, like he was watching it from underwater. He could hear the hum of the lights, the scratch of a chair leg against the floor, the faint sound of someone swallowing hard. What he could not hear was anyone saying that she was wrong. Only a few hours earlier, the morning had started very differently. In a modest apartment not far from the school, Ethan had woken to the familiar sound of his father's voice calling up the stairs. Breakfast in 5. No rank, no title, just routine. The Carter home did not look like anything special. The furniture was clean, but clearly loved for many years. Family photos lined the walls, but none of them showed uniforms or medals. That was intentional. Security was not something discussed openly in the house. It was simply a way of life, as normal to Ethan as locking the door or checking both ways before crossing the street. His father, Richard Cole, sat at the kitchen table in jeans and a faded sweatshirt, scanning emails with the calm focus of someone used to making decisions quietly. After nearly 3 decades of military service, he had learned that power did not need to announce itself. Ethan's mother, Laura Cole, moved efficiently between the counter and the sink, already dressed in her hospital scrubs. She would be at Capital Children's Medical Center before most of the city was fully awake. Her work saved lives in ways that rarely made headlines, and she preferred it that way. On the refrigerator door hung a simple drawing in crayon. A stick figure stood proudly, shoulders marked with 4 small stars. Beneath it, written in uneven letters, was the word Dad. Next to the drawing, today's date was circled on the calendar. Career Day. Ethan had been counting down to it for weeks. He had asked his father careful questions, phrasing them in ways that felt safe. He wanted to tell his classmates something true, something meaningful. Without breaking rules he only partially understood. His father had met his eyes across the table that morning, the way he always did when the conversation mattered. "Keep it simple," he said gently. "You don't have to prove anything." Ethan nodded, even though a part of him wondered why other kids never had to be careful when they talked about their parents. Why pride seemed to come with conditions in his house. Now, standing in his classroom with everyone watching him, those questions returned, heavier than before. Margaret Sloan called the class back to order and instructed them to open their textbooks. The lesson moved on, as if nothing unusual had happened, as if a child had not just been dismantled in front of his peers. Ethan lowered himself into his chair slowly, his hands trembling just enough that he tucked them under his desk. Beside him, Malik Thompson leaned over slightly, his voice barely more than air. "You okay?" Ethan nodded once. It was easier than explaining. What neither of them knew yet was that this moment, this tearing sound, would not remain contained within the walls of the classroom. Assumptions had been made. Words had been spoken aloud that could not be taken back. And before the day was over, the truth would arrive in a form no one in that room had prepared for. For now, though, all Ethan could do was sit, still, surrounded by adults who believed they understood the world better than he did, and wonder how telling the truth had turned into something he was being punished for. Long before the paper tore in the classroom, the rules of silence had already been written into Ethan Carter's life. They were not written down anywhere. There was no list taped to the refrigerator or spoken aloud like a warning. They existed instead in habits, in pauses, in the careful way his parents answered certain questions and gently redirected others. That morning began like most mornings in the Carter household. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes from routine rather than loneliness. Sunlight slipped through half-open blinds, touching the edges of furniture that had been used and reused, repaired instead of replaced. Nothing in the living room announced importance. No plaques, no framed achievements. Just a couch that had survived several moves and a small bookshelf packed with paperbacks and school binders. Ethan padded downstairs in socks, still rubbing sleep from his eyes, when he heard his father's voice from the kitchen. "Breakfast in 5. It wasn't a command. It was a rhythm. Richard Cole sat at the table with a mug of coffee, dressed in jeans and a soft, worn sweatshirt from a college Ethan couldn't remember visiting. To anyone else, he looked like an ordinary man getting ready for an ordinary day. That was exactly the point. After nearly 29 years in the military, Richard had learned that visibility could invite questions, and questions could invite risks. The higher his responsibilities climbed, the quieter his personal life became. Not because he was ashamed, but because discretion kept people safe. Ethan climbed into his chair, watching his father scroll through messages on his phone. None of them looked urgent. None of them hinted at the decisions being made quietly behind closed doors, the meetings that shaped lives far beyond the walls of that apartment. Laura Cole moved through the kitchen with efficient grace, already dressed in pale blue scrubs. Her day would begin in operating rooms and hospital corridors, where children waited with parents who were holding on to hope. She poured herself coffee, kissed Ethan on the head, and slid a plate toward him. "Big day," she said softly. Ethan nodded, a smile pulling at the corners of his mouth despite the knot already forming in his stomach. Career day. He had circled the date himself, pressing hard with the marker so it would stand out. Other kids talked about it constantly, about what their parents would wear, what stories they would tell. He wanted to tell the truth, just not all of it. "Dad," he asked carefully, "can I say what you do?" Richard looked up, meeting his son's eyes. There was no alarm there, only thoughtfulness. He exchanged a glance with Laura, the kind of look that carried years of shared understanding. "You can say, it's simply," Richard said. "You don't need details." Ethan hesitated. "Other kids get to talk about everything." "I know," his father replied. His voice was calm, but something heavy lived beneath it. "Our family works a little differently." That was always the answer. Ethan understood it in pieces. He knew his father traveled. He knew sometimes goodbyes came early in the morning and returns happened quietly at night. He knew there were reasons he wasn't told everything. What he didn't understand was why truth had to be folded smaller in his hands than it was in other kids. Laura reached across the table and squeezed Richard's hand. "He deserves to be proud," she said gently. "I know," Richard said, "and he can be. Pride doesn't have to be loud." Ethan finished his breakfast, trying to hold on to that idea. Pride doesn't have to be loud. It sounded wise. It sounded grown up. It did not make the knot in his stomach disappear. Before leaving, Ethan paused by the refrigerator. The crayon drawing was still there, corners curling slightly. 4 stars, drawn carefully, one at a time. He touched the paper lightly, then grabbed his backpack and headed out the door. By the time Ethan reached Riverside Elementary, the apartment felt very far away. Inside the school, the halls buzzed with a different kind of energy. Parents signed in at the front desk. Visitors wore name tags and polite smiles. Teachers straightened bulletin boards and rearranged desks. Career Day always brought out performances, even from adults. In Margaret Sloane's classroom, that performance had already begun. She had arranged chairs neatly, prepared talking points, and rehearsed the welcoming tone she would use with each guest. She took pride in order. She took pride in knowing what to expect. When she handed out the assignment earlier that morning, she had watched the students carefully. She noticed who wrote quickly and who hesitated, who smiled while writing and who frowned. When she passed Ethan's desk, she paused. She read his words silently, her expression tightening just enough for him to notice. She didn't say anything then. She didn't need to. In her mind, the story had already been categorized. There were stories that fit the world as she understood it, and stories that did not. By the time the class gathered to share their writing, her certainty had settled into place. Years of experience told her she was right. Experience, she believed, was proof enough. That belief was what followed Ethan when she stopped him mid-sentence. It was what guided her voice when she explained embellishment and honesty. It was what allowed her to tear the paper without hesitation. And it was what made it so easy for everyone else to stay quiet. Back at the Carter apartment, Richard's phone buzzed with a message he hadn't expected to see yet. A meeting had shifted. His return would be later than planned, but still in time. He typed a short reply, careful not to include details, and sent it to Ethan. He did not know what was already unfolding in that classroom. He did not know that the rules he had taught his son for safety were about to be used against him. That the quiet they lived by was being mistaken for absence. That restraint was being read as deception. For now, Ethan sat at his desk, eyes lowered, trying to remember his father's words. Pride doesn't have to be loud. What he did not know yet was that by the end of the day, silence would no longer protect him. And the truth, carefully folded and kept small, would demand more space than anyone expected. By the time the parents began arriving, the classroom no longer felt like a place meant for children. The desks were the same, the posters on the walls unchanged, but something in the air had shifted. Adults filled the back of the room, carrying briefcases, tote bags, uniforms, and the quiet confidence that came from being seen as legitimate before they even spoke. Ethan sat at his desk, shoulders slightly hunched, his backpack hooked carefully around one chair leg. He kept his eyes forward, though he could feel the presence behind him. He recognized the rhythm of polished shoes against the floor, the rustle of jackets being folded over chairbacks, the polite murmurs exchanged between strangers who already assumed they belonged. Margaret Sloane moved through the room, greeting each guest, her smile adjusting almost instinctively. To the attorney in the tailored suit, she offered a firm handshake and a compliment about public service. To the software consultant, she nodded appreciatively and asked about innovation. When a nurse arrived, still wearing scrubs from the night shift, Margaret thanked her for her work, but quickly turned to rearrange chairs. The conversation ended before it could deepen. Ethan noticed all of it. He always did. Career Day, Margaret announced, was about learning what mattered in the world, about understanding how different jobs contributed to the community. She spoke warmly, confidently, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to being listened to. Then she called on the students to read their assignments aloud. One by one, children stood and shared stories about meetings, offices, projects, and achievements. Some presentations were met with enthusiastic nods. Others passed quickly, acknowledged but not explored. When it was Ethan's turn, the room felt suddenly smaller. He stood, holding the rewritten copy of his assignment. The original, the one that had been torn, was gone. This version was identical in content, though his handwriting was slightly less steady. He cleared his throat and began to read. "My dad is a 4-star general in the United States Army," he said quietly. "He has served for almost 3 decades in different parts of the world. He helps make decisions that keep people safe." Margaret Sloane's expression changed immediately. "Stop," she said. The word cut through the room with surprising sharpness. Conversations behind Ethan stopped. Chairs stilled. Parents looked up, some with curiosity, others with discomfort. Margaret stepped forward slowly, folding her arms. She addressed the class as if Ethan were not standing right there. "This," she said, "is an example of exaggeration. Sometimes children want to impress others, especially when important adults are present." Ethan felt heat rise to his face. "I'm not exaggerating," he said. His voice shook, but he did not raise it. "That's really what my dad does." Margaret smiled, though it did not reach her eyes. "I've been teaching for over 25 years, she replied. "I've met generals. I've taught their children. They don't live quietly. Their families are well known." She glanced briefly at Ethan's sneakers, then away again. "Lucas," she corrected herself quickly, then continued without apology. "I mean, Ethan, I need you to be honest with everyone." A few students shifted in their seats. Malik leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowed. "He is being honest," Malik said before he could stop himself. Margaret turned toward him. "Sit down," she said, her tone firm. "This is not your place." The room fell quiet again. Ethan's heart pounded so loudly he was sure everyone could hear it. He wanted to explain. He wanted to tell them about the rules, about security, about why forms listed his father's job vaguely. He wanted to say that none of this was a game, but the words came out wrong when he tried. "My dad keeps a low profile," he said, "because of his job." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Low profile," she repeated. "And what would that be for exactly?" Ethan hesitated. He knew better than to say more. He had been taught that some explanations were not meant for public rooms. The hesitation was taken as confirmation. Margaret straightened. "Here's what we're going to do," she said, turning to the parents. "Ethan is going to apologize for sharing false information. Then he will rewrite this assignment truthfully." The word false echoed. Ethan's hands clenched at his sides. "I don't have anything to apologize for," he said, more firmly than he felt. A ripple of reaction moved through the room. A parent near the window inhaled sharply. Someone else looked down at their lap. Margaret's expression hardened. "Ethan," she said, "this is not optional." She gestured toward the door. "You can go to the office if you'd like to continue this conversation there." Before Ethan could respond, Malik stood up again. "That's not fair," he said. "He didn't lie." Margaret's voice did not rise. It did not need to. "Office," she said, pointing. "Now." Malik hesitated only a moment before grabbing his backpack and leaving the room. He glanced back at Ethan once, his expression apologetic and angry all at once. Ethan felt something inside him sink. He had always known that telling the truth did not guarantee being believed. What he was learning now was how quickly doubt could turn into punishment, especially when adults decided they already understood the story. Margaret turned back to the class, smoothing her expression. "Let this be a lesson," she said. "Honesty matters. Humility matters. Making yourself seem more important than you are does not." Her eyes flicked briefly toward Ethan again. "Especially when you come from backgrounds that already face challenges." The words settled heavily. Ethan stared at his desk, the empty space where his original paper had once been. The clock on the wall ticked steadily forward. Somewhere in the building, phones rang. Parents shifted in their seats. Career day continued. For Ethan, everything had narrowed to a single thought. His father was coming, he knew that. He had the message to prove it. But proof, he was learning, only mattered when the right people were willing to look. As he stood and walked toward the door, summoned again to the office, he felt the weight of every eye in the room on his back. Not with cruelty exactly, but with judgment shaped by assumption. Behind him, Margaret Sloane resumed her welcoming tone, introducing the next guest as if nothing unusual had occurred. And in that moment, Ethan understood something that would stay with him long after the day ended. Truth does not protect you on its own. It needs someone willing to listen. The hallway outside the classroom felt longer than it ever had. Ethan walked slowly, his sneakers making small, echoing sounds against the polished floor. Each step seemed to stretch time, as if the building itself were asking him to reconsider, to turn back, to say something different. He did none of those things. He kept his eyes forward and followed the familiar route toward the administrative offices, the place where problems were supposed to be solved. Inside the office, the atmosphere was quiet in a different way. Phones rang softly, Papers were stacked neatly. A receptionist offered a tight smile that did not ask questions. Ethan was guided into a smaller room and told to wait. He sat in a chair that was slightly too tall for him, his feet barely touching the floor. He folded his hands in his lap to keep them from shaking. A few moments later, Vice Principal Alan Brooks entered, holding a thin folder. He closed the door behind him gently, as if this were a conversation meant to remain calm. "Ethan," he said, taking a seat across from him. "I understand there was some confusion in class." Ethan nodded. Confusion felt like the wrong word, but he did not correct it. Alan Brooks had been at Riverside Elementary for years. He wore khakis and a school logo polo, the uniform of someone who knew the system well. His voice carried the practiced patience of an adult who believed he had seen every version of this situation before. "I looked at your file," he continued, opening the folder. "Your father is listed as a government employee." "That's what he puts on forms," Ethan said quickly, "for security reasons." Alan smiled slightly, the way adults do when they think they are being generous. "I understand wanting to protect your family," he said, "but sometimes children misunderstand what their parents do, or they simplify it in ways that sound bigger than they are." Ethan felt his chest tighten. "I didn't misunderstand," he said. "He really is a general." Alan raised a hand gently. "Let's slow down," he said. "I'm not saying you meant to lie." The words did not land the way he seemed to expect. Alan leaned back in his chair. "Kids sometimes create stories when they feel overlooked," he said. "It's a way of feeling important, especially when they see other families getting attention." Ethan stared at the folder on the desk. His name was printed there, neat and official. The system already knew him, and somehow that knowledge was being used against him. "My dad is coming today," Ethan said. "He texted me. He was traveling." Alan glanced at Ethan's phone briefly when it was offered, then looked away. "A text message isn't something we can verify," he said. "Anyone can save a contact under any name." The word verify hung in the air. Ethan's hands clenched. "So what do you want me to do?" Alan folded his hands together, as if the solution were obvious. "You're going to return to class," he said. "You're going to apologize to Mrs. Sloan for being disrespectful. Then you're going to rewrite your assignment with information we can confirm." Ethan felt something drop inside him, but that wouldn't be true. Alan sighed just slightly. "Ethan," he said, lowering his voice, "truth also means being realistic." The office felt smaller. The walls seemed closer. "My mom is a surgeon," Ethan said suddenly. "She works at Capital Children's Medical Center. My dad has been deployed 5 times. He's been gone for months at a time." Alan's expression softened, but only a little. "I hear you," he said. "But none of that changes what we have on record." Ethan realized then that this was not a conversation about facts. It was about comfort, about keeping things orderly, about not letting a child disrupt a narrative adults found easier to manage. "You don't believe me," Ethan said quietly. Alan hesitated. "I believe you want attention," he said, "and that's understandable." The words landed harder than any accusation had so far. Ethan stood slowly, the chair scraping softly behind him. His vision blurred, but he refused to cry. He had already learned that emotion did not make adults listen more carefully. "My father serves this country," he said. "He earned the right to be believed." Alan looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded toward the door. "Go back to class," he said. "We'll move forward from there." When Ethan returned to the hallway, He noticed movement near the front office. Staff members spoke in low voices. Someone checked a phone and frowned. Another person typed quickly at a computer. No one explained anything to him. Back in the classroom, the mood had shifted again. More parents had arrived. Chairs were filled. The room buzzed with polite conversation and expectation. Margaret Sloan stood at the front, introducing the next guest with her practiced smile. When she saw Ethan re-enter, her expression tightened just enough to register irritation. "Ethan," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "Do you have something you'd like to say to us?" The room went quiet. This was not the same silence as before. This time, adults were watching closely. Professionals, strangers, people who would carry this moment with them long after they left the school. Ethan felt the weight of their attention settle on him. He thought of his father's message. He thought of his mother's quiet strength. He thought of Malik sitting alone in the office for defending him. "I don't have anything to apologize for," Ethan said. A few parents shifted uncomfortably. Someone cleared their throat. Margaret's smile disappeared. "Then you leave me no choice," she said. "You can spend the rest of career day in the office." Ethan's stomach dropped, but he did not sit down. "My dad will be here," he said. "You'll see." Margaret shook her head. "Your father is not coming," she said firmly, "and continuing this fantasy is not helping you." The word fantasy echoed in Ethan's mind as he turned toward the door again. This time he walked more slowly, not because he was afraid, but because something inside him had hardened. As he stepped into the hallway, he noticed the front doors again. Outside, cars were pulling in and out of the circular drive. Nothing looked unusual, nothing yet. What Ethan did not know was that, at that very moment, a phone call was being returned, an email confirmed, a schedule adjusted. And the system that had dismissed him was about to encounter something it could not explain away so easily. The first sign that something was different came quietly. It was not an announcement over the intercom, nor a sudden interruption to the presentations unfolding inside the classrooms. It was a change in rhythm, a pause in the ordinary flow of the school day that most people would not have noticed unless they were already uneasy. Ethan noticed. Standing in the hallway outside the classroom for the second time that morning, he felt it in the way adults began to move with purpose rather than habit. A staff member checked the front doors and then checked again. Someone lowered their voice while speaking into a phone. Another person glanced at a watch and frowned, then nodded as if receiving instructions. Ethan sat on the bench outside the office, his backpack resting at his feet. He did not know what was happening, only that the tightness in his chest had shifted. It was no longer just fear. It was waiting. Inside the administrative office, Principal Denise Harper held a phone to her ear, her posture unusually rigid. She had been an administrator for years. She knew what routine calls sounded like. This was not one of them. "Yes," she said quietly. "We can accommodate." She listened, then straightened even further. "Of course. We'll make the necessary arrangements." When the call ended, she remained still for a moment, staring at the screen as if confirming it was real. Then she stood and moved quickly toward the hallway. "Patricia," she said, stepping into the classroom doorway. Her voice was calm, but it carried weight. "I need to see you." Margaret Sloan blinked in surprise. She rarely left her classroom during career day. "I'm in the middle of—" "Now," Principal Harper said gently, and used Margaret's first name again. That alone was enough. Murmurs rippled through the parents seated along the walls as Margaret followed the principal into the hallway. The door closed softly behind them. Ethan watched from the bench as the two women stood just a few steps away, their voices low but urgent. Margaret's posture shifted from confident to confused, then to something else entirely. "What do you mean, security detail?" Margaret whispered. Principal Harper kept her voice even. "I've just spent 20 minutes on the phone confirming clearance," she said. "Parking, entry, timing." Margaret shook her head. "For career day?" "For Ethan Carter's father." The hallway seemed to tilt. Margaret's face drained of color. "That's not possible," she said. "I checked. He's listed as a government employee." "Yes," Principal Harper replied, "because senior military officials keep a low profile for security." Margaret's mouth opened, then closed again. "You're saying—" "I'm saying," Principal Harper said, "that the child you publicly accused of lying has been telling the truth." Margaret's hand rose to her mouth. Oh my God. Outside the front doors of Riverside Elementary, 3 dark vehicles rolled quietly into the circular drive. They did not draw attention to themselves. They did not need to. Men and women in plain, professional attire stepped out first, scanning the area with practiced ease. Parents nearby paused mid-conversation, sensing something unusual without understanding it. Then a man emerged from the center vehicle. He stood tall, composed, wearing a full military dress uniform. The fabric was dark and immaculate. Medals rested neatly across his chest, each one representing service, time, and decisions made far from classrooms like this one. On his shoulders, 4 silver stars caught the late morning light. General Richard Cole had arrived. Inside the hallway, Principal Harper straightened her jacket and moved forward to meet him. "General Cole," she said, "I'm Denise Harper, principal here. I want to apologize for—" He shook her hand briefly. "I appreciate your cooperation on short notice," he said. His voice was calm, measured, professional. "I understand there was a misunderstanding involving my son." Behind her, Margaret Sloan stood frozen, every assumption she had relied on collapsing in silence. The general's eyes moved to her, not with anger, but with assessment. "You're Ethan's teacher," he said. "Yes," Margaret replied, her voice barely audible. "Sir, I'm not here to cause a scene," he said gently. "I'm here to check on my child." The simplicity of the statement made it impossible to argue with. Inside the classroom, the presentations had stalled. Parents whispered. Someone glanced toward the hallway window and stiffened. "That's a 4-star general," a man murmured, his voice hushed with disbelief. Chairs scraped softly as several parents stood without thinking, posture adjusting instinctively. The atmosphere shifted from polite interest to stunned awareness. Ethan felt it before he saw it. He looked up as footsteps approached, slow and deliberate. The classroom door opened, and Principal Harper stepped inside, her expression carefully composed. "Class," she said, "we have a guest joining us." Margaret Sloan followed, her face pale, her confidence gone. Then General Richard Cole entered the room. The silence that followed was different from any Ethan had experienced that day. It was not uncomfortable, it was reverent. Every adult in the room stood, not because they were told to, but because something deep inside them recognized authority shaped by responsibility rather than volume. Ethan's breath caught. "Dad," he whispered. The general's expression softened instantly. He crossed the room in long, steady strides, stopping in front of Ethan's desk. Without hesitation, without concern for appearances, he knelt down so they were at eye level. "I'm here," he said quietly. "I'm sorry I was late." Something inside Ethan finally broke. He leaned forward, pressing his face against the familiar fabric of his father's uniform. The tears came then, not from shame, but from release. For a few seconds, nothing else existed. When the general stood, he kept a hand on Ethan's shoulder. He faced the room, his voice calm and clear. "My son wrote that I am a 4-star general," he said. "Every word of that statement is true." He paused, letting the truth settle. "He also wrote that leadership means serving others, not yourself," the general continued. He learned that lesson by watching his family sacrifice quietly, without recognition. His gaze moved to Margaret Sloan. "Ma'am," he said. There was no confusion here. There was no verification. There were assumptions. He let the words rest in the space between them. "You didn't verify," he said. "You assumed." Margaret's shoulders slumped. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I owe Ethan an apology," she said. The general looked down at his son. "That's your decision," he said softly. Ethan took a breath. The room waited. And for the first time that day, the truth was not alone. For several seconds after General Richard Cole finished speaking, no one moved. The classroom, which had been filled all morning with murmurs, explanations, and polite interruptions, seemed to forget how to make sound. Parents stood frozen beside their chairs. Students stared wide-eyed, unsure whether this was still career day or something entirely different. Ethan remained seated, his father's hand resting lightly on his shoulder. The steady weight of it grounded him. He could still feel the place on his face where he had pressed against the uniform, the warmth of familiarity that had cut through hours of disbelief. Margaret Sloan stood near her desk, hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her face was flushed, not with anger now, but with something far more uncomfortable: recognition. She had replayed the morning's events in her mind in rapid fragments, the paper tearing, the confident explanations, the way she had looked at Ethan and decided she understood his story better than he did. General Cole turned slightly, addressing the room rather than her alone. "I've spent nearly 3 decades leading people in difficult places," he said. "One lesson has followed me everywhere. When someone tells you their truth, especially when it doesn't match your expectations, your first responsibility is to listen." He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. The words landed precisely because they were calm. Margaret swallowed hard. She stepped forward, her shoes sounding loud against the floor in the quiet room. When she spoke, her voice trembled, but she did not stop. "Ethan," she said, "I was wrong." The simplicity of the sentence seemed to surprise even her. "I judged you," she continued. "I didn't listen. I decided what your life should look like instead of believing what you told me." Her breath caught. "I hurt you, and I did it in front of everyone." The parents watched closely now, no longer passive observers. This was not the kind of apology they were used to hearing. "You didn't deserve that," Margaret said. "You deserved respect. You deserved to be believed." Tears slipped down her face, unhidden. "I am truly sorry." Ethan felt the room shift again. Not dramatically, but gently, as if something heavy had finally been set down. General Cole looked at his son, his expression asking a question rather than giving direction. Ethan took a breath. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but steady. "My dad says everyone makes mistakes," he said. "He says what matters is what you do after." Margaret nodded quickly. "I will do better," she said. "I promise." The words were not grand. They did not undo the morning, but they were real. Principal Denise Harper stepped forward then, her voice measured and clear. "What happened today should not have happened," she said. "And it will not happen again." She spoke briefly about new expectations, about listening before reacting, about checking facts quietly rather than correcting children publicly. Her words were careful, chosen to fit the moment rather than overpower it. General Cole listened, then reached into his pocket. He removed a small, worn object and held it out to Margaret. It was a simple coin, no larger than a silver dollar, its surface marked with an emblem unfamiliar to most of the room. "This is something I give to people who demonstrate responsibility," he said. "Not perfection." Margaret hesitated, then accepted it with both hands, nodding silently. For the remainder of the morning, career day continued, though it felt transformed. General Cole spoke briefly to the class, not about rank or authority, but about service. He talked about teamwork, about showing up for others even when no one notices. He mentioned Ethan's mother as well, explaining that saving lives in quiet hospital rooms required just as much courage as any uniformed role. Several parents nodded, some wiping their eyes. Students asked questions, careful and curious. The general answered them patiently, keeping his words simple and his tone warm. He made sure to look at each child, not just the ones closest to him. When it was time for a group photo, students gathered naturally, without being told. Ethan stood near the center, his father's presence steady beside him. There was no dramatic pose, no forced smiles, just a moment captured that felt honest. By early afternoon, the parents had left. The chairs were stacked again. The classroom returned to its usual shape. Ethan walked out of the building with his father, sunlight bright on the steps. The world felt quieter now, not because the noise had disappeared, but because it no longer pressed so hard against his chest. They did not speak much on the drive home. They did not need to. That evening, the Carter apartment looked the same as it always had. The same couch, the same bookshelf. Nothing about it had changed, and yet everything felt different. Ethan sat between his parents on the couch, still tired, but lighter. Laura brushed his hair back gently, her touch familiar and reassuring. "How are you feeling?" she asked. Ethan thought for a moment. "Tired," he said. "But, okay." Richard nodded. "That's fair." Ethan looked up at his father. "Why didn't you tell the school before?" he asked. "Then none of this would have happened." Richard was quiet for a long moment. "Because I never wanted you to think your value came from my job," he said. "But I see now that keeping things too quiet put you in a position you shouldn't have been in." He placed a hand over Ethan's. "You shouldn't have had to stand alone today." Ethan leaned into his mother's side. "I don't feel alone now," he said. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the small but significant shift that had taken place inside one classroom. Tomorrow, most people would return to routine. Lessons would be taught, papers would be written. But something had been learned that could not be erased. Not about rank, not about authority, about listening. The story did not end when the classroom emptied. It never does. In the days that followed Career Day, Riverside Elementary returned to its routines. Bells rang. Homework was assigned. Children laughed in hallways and argued over playground rules. On the surface, everything looked the same. But underneath, small things had shifted. Margaret Sloan sat at her desk one afternoon, long after the students had gone home. The classroom was dim, lit only by the late light filtering through the windows. She held the coin General Cole had given her, turning it slowly between her fingers. Responsibility, not perfection. The words echoed louder in the quiet than they ever had during the school day. For the first time in many years, Margaret replayed her own certainty with discomfort. She thought about how easily experience had become armor, how often she had relied on patterns instead of listening, how quickly she had confused confidence with correctness. The next morning, she stood before her class and did something she had never done before. She explained what bias was without using the word itself. She talked about assumptions, about how adults could be wrong, and about how listening mattered more than appearing knowledgeable. She did not single Ethan out. She did not dramatize the moment. She simply told the truth. Across the room, Ethan listened quietly. He did not feel triumphant. He did not feel embarrassed. He felt something steadier than either. He felt seen. At home, the Carter family settled back into their rhythms. Richard returned to travel and meetings that could not be discussed in detail. Laura's shifts remained long and demanding. The apartment remained modest, unchanged by the revelation that had stunned an entire classroom. One evening, Ethan worked on homework at the kitchen table while his parents talked softly nearby. He paused, tapping his pencil against the page. "Do you think people will treat me differently now?" he asked. Laura glanced at Richard, then answered carefully. "Some will," she said, "but not always for the reasons you might expect." Richard leaned forward. "What matters," he said, "is that you know who you are, even when others don't." Ethan nodded, absorbing the words slowly. At school, changes appeared in quiet ways. Teachers were encouraged to verify concerns privately. Meetings emphasized listening first, correction second. Students were reminded that their experiences mattered, even when they were inconvenient. None of it made headlines. None of it went viral. And that was the point. Ethan noticed the difference in smaller moments. When he raised his hand, he was not interrupted. When he explained something that sounded unusual, he was asked questions instead of dismissed. When Malik spoke up in class again, no one sent him to the office. The world had not become perfect, but it had become slightly more careful. One afternoon, as Ethan packed his backpack, Margaret Sloan stopped by his desk. She did not loom. She did not lecture. "I'm glad you spoke up," she said quietly. "That wasn't easy." Ethan nodded. "My dad says speaking up isn't about being loud," he replied. "It's about being steady." Margaret smiled, genuinely this time. "Your father taught you well?" As weeks turned into months, the story faded into memory for most people. Parents remembered it as an unusual career day. Teachers remembered it as a lesson learned. For Ethan, it became something else entirely. It became proof. Proof that telling the truth was worth the risk, even when it hurt. Proof that dignity did not come from titles or uniforms, but from being heard. Proof that children notice far more than adults assume, and that believing them the first time can change everything. One evening, long after homework was finished, and the apartment had settled into quiet, Ethan lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The day replayed itself in fragments, no longer sharp, no longer overwhelming. He thought about the sound of paper tearing. He thought about the silence that followed. He thought about the moment his father knelt in front of him, not as a general, but as a parent. And he understood something he had not understood before. The truth does not always arrive on time. But when it does, it asks something of everyone who hears it. To listen, to pause, to choose belief over comfort. Somewhere else in another classroom, another child might be standing alone, holding on to a truth that doesn't match what the world expects. There might not be a uniformed parent waiting in the hallway. There might not be a dramatic arrival to correct the moment, which is why the real lesson was never about rank or recognition. It was about believing children first. Because sometimes, the most powerful change begins not with authority walking through the door, but with someone choosing to listen before tearing the truth apart. The room